everyone. Well, ooh.
Test, test.
Josh's mic works. Thank you, Josh. Hold on.
Uh-oh, there you go.
All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and get started with our afternoon panel. And I just want to thank everyone who submitted questions. There were some really awesome ones. If we have time, we're even going to share some of the topics we couldn't get to because there was just so much good stuff. We're not sure how much we'll be able to fit in. But let me get off the stage and introduce our panel quickly. First up, where are you? At the end, Andrew Thomas. Wave to the people, Andrew. Is the Director of Data Science at SMT, based in Durham, North Carolina. Before that, he was the lead hockey researcher for the Minnesota Wild from 2016 to 19, and has consulted for multiple MLB teams. He was a professor of statistics and data science at Carnegie Mellon University and the University of Florida, and founded a little-known website called War on Ice back in 2014. Pour one out for War on Ice. Next up, we have Christopher Boucher. Say hello to the folks, Chris. He is VP of Hockey Analytics and Operations at SportLogic. He has worked as an NHL team consultant for over 10 years and has over 2 decades of experience in hockey analytics and microstats. Christopher developed the first ever complete and binary microstat tracking system in hockey and is the creator of the microstat definitions, reports, and insights used by 30 NHL teams, 14 SHL teams, multiple junior hockey teams, and 2 hockey federations. Due to his ability to translate raw data into easy-to-digest and actionable team and player information, he is recognized by NHL and SHL teams as a leading authority on event and tracking data in hockey. Next up, Blue Jackets fans be kind, is the wonderful Chris MacFarland. Say hi to the people. Chris is in his 5th season as the Assistant General Manager for the Colorado Avalanche, who will face off against the Blue Jackets tonight. Before that, he was a member of the Columbus Blue Jackets Hockey Operations Department for 16 years, assisting in almost every area of hockey operations. Chris also played college hockey at Pace University, where he received a bachelor's degree in business in 1992 and later graduated from the university's law school in 1998. Our final panelist is Josh Flynn.
Hello.
Who said I could write his bio. So first and most importantly, I would like you all to know that he has an adorable dog named Jack. But Josh is also Assistant General Manager for the Blue Jackets, meaning he is responsible for assisting in all facets of the Hockey Operations Department, including statistical research and strategic planning. Flynn joined the Blue Jackets Hockey Operations Department in 2018 after spending the previous 2 seasons with KO Sports Agency in Denver. He received a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Toronto and earned his Juris Doctorate from the Sturm College of Law at the University of Denver. And finally, but not at all least, we are honored to have Seth Partnow here. He is an NBA analyst for The Athletic. He has such a strong understanding of the application of data onto the game. Prior to being with The Athletic, he spent 3 years as the Director of Basketball Research for the Milwaukee Bucks, working extensively with the same sort of player and ball tracking data which is coming to the NHL. Growing up in Anchorage, Alaska, his youth hockey career was effectively ended by a hard but clean open ice hit from Scott Gomez. He resides in Milwaukee with his wife, 2 children, and 3 cats. I will note that there are no dogs mentioned. I'll hand it over to Seth.
Thanks, Allison. I guess why I, as a basketball person, am up here moderating is because of the new wave of data that's kind of in progress and coming into the NHL right now. So I wanted to start off with a question for the panel. It seems like a lot of questions have been answered by, well, when we get tracking data, ... And the question I want to answer, I want to start with is, I think we all agree that's not quite right. There's things that have to happen first before you can, tracking data, hockey solved. So what are some of the intermediate steps, the lower hanging fruit, whether from tracking data or from microstats, other data, that you think can still be addressed, that need to be addressed and can still be addressed before we really fully understand what's going on the ice, whether it's strategic, player value, sports science, and on and on. And I think just start with Andrew and come down this way.
Oh boy. What needs to be done in the intermediate, there's lots of pieces that need to go into it, obviously, other than just collecting data, right?
To make it put a little more fine point on it, what are some of the understandings, the intermediate understandings that are not necessarily what needs to happen technically, but what will we learn first before we know everything?
I think we're going to learn the easy stuff first, like how fast players are going. Like, even just starting off with a very basic idea of what we're getting now compared to what we were getting before. So a panelist before talked about that picture of you're turning the lights on very quickly and off. I think that's a Tulski original quote where he was saying, you're getting this, you used to be getting that every 10 seconds in a game to see what's happening with a shot or a pass, or not a pass, a hit or a penalty. And now, with at least with what SportLogic's been doing, you can get that every 1 second with some more detail. And now you've got a very active system coming in that's supposedly going to do that at whatever you see on your television. Now, it's not going to get you everything. If you're trying to project what you're seeing on this, what you think you're getting from the data, instead of, I was using the bubble hockey example of myself earlier, but you're not even getting, where they're pointing. But you're basically going to get the idea of a person without any arms or legs standing up on the ice, across the ice surface, and how fast they're moving and turning and so forth. And so even just starting with understanding that that part of it is new and hasn't really been dug into a lot already, just starts thinking, let's even just start with the simpler stuff. How fast the player's going is useful. It may not be, it's definitely not going to solve every problem, but it may start you thinking about what other pieces of information are going to follow almost immediately.
For me, I think the first thing we're going to learn is what we can and can't get from that information, right? There's an idea that we're going to get everything from tracking, or we're going to get everything from this or everything from this. Really, what we're trying to find is what are we going to use to clear up all the blind spots? Because there's going to be blind spots with whatever we're using. If we're just having tracking, we're going to have blind spots to know the events, who's doing what, right? A great example is there's a battle on the half wall. Who got that puck? If we just have player tracking a puck, we're not really going to have that information. So the key now is to combine that with event data, right? Event data in its current format also has blind spot with everybody else's on the ice, right? So it's just about clearing up those blind spots. So I think the first thing we're going to figure out is what can and can't we know from the data.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's going to fill in a lot of the blind spots. I think when we started getting data from SportLogic, it filled in bigger blind spots that we didn't have before, and it's going to keep continuing to do that. I think one item is kind of like what Andrew said, is speed and skating and everything related to that's going to give us a lot of information, and we don't have that now. I know our director of high performance, Nelson Ayotte, was sitting behind me all morning long. He's gone now, but he's been waiting for this stuff mainly to get that, because it's going to tell him a lot about load, and it's going to give him a lot of information on that front. And then, kind of like Chris said, I think there's some stuff we don't know what we're going to get yet. When we got SportLogic, we found out stuff we didn't know we were missing. So it's just going to be another layer, and it's going to be more of the same.
Yeah, I think what Josh just said was what initially what popped into my head is you find out with each layer of information things that you weren't even thinking about, or your analysts weren't even thinking about, and it leads you down these different pathways to see if you can find out what's noise, what's helpful to the coaches, what's helpful to your strength and conditioning guys, your development guys, and it leads to different discussion points.
I wanted to stick kind of on the data side just for a second. The rest of these questions kind of came either online or from people dropping stuff in the box. Thanks. People wrote their names, but most of them are illegible, so sorry, I won't say who asked each question. For Andrew and Chris B., one of the common questions is about public availability of whether it's going to be tracking data, SportLogic data, stuff like that, to increase whether that's from a fan service perspective or to give kind of public analysts more to chew on. What can we look forward to in that regard to the extent you're able to talk about it?
I'm afraid I have a very stock answer for you, and that's you have to ask the NHL, because I don't know. There's policy decisions there. Like, SMT is a provider. We're putting in equipment to get this stuff, but we're doing it at the NHL's behest. So they're going to have to make those decisions. But I can say that I know that in the past, more data availability helped. And like pitch effects was the big one that I've seen in baseball, which was in 2006 or so. It was leaked. Like, it was not deliberately put out there, but people figured out how to get pitch effects through the Game Day app. And suddenly, it changed the whole sphere, not only of what baseball analysts were doing, but how baseball was hiring people. So if it ever does get leaked, it won't be by me, but it would be very interesting to see who's picking that stuff up in the end. I think it's in their interest to make it available as widely as possible because we want more people working on it. But there are other interests that say, like, information wants to be free but comes at a high price. I forget the exact quote.
To jump back in real quick, the similar thing happened with the sport view data from basketball. There was animations put on the NBA's website. People figured out how to scrape them. All of a sudden, people are kind of working with the raw tracking data, and that people got hired from that. So I think I like that phenomenon. I agree with. So.
Didn't that also happen with the NFL and Next Gen Stats? I remember seeing a thing at the New England Symposium where someone took the pictures of quarterback plays, which were circles on this field, and basically just going in, yoinking them, taking the coordinates, and saying, "Yep, there's our data."
Yeah, and also some of that the NFL has obviously worked very hard to kind of push that out there. Sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I agree with Andrew. It's really going to depend. From our perspective, we have kind of two verticals, right? We have the teams that we provide data to, and we also we're working with the NHL as well. So we're providing data to the NHL. What the NHL does with that, it's going to really be decided by the NHL, and it's really going to hinge on things that the NHL is interested in. So that would be obviously there's gaming and there's fan engagement, there's broadcast rights. So that's what's going to determine what the NHL puts out publicly. In terms of the teams, I don't think teams are necessarily excited about putting out anything publicly. So those are kind of our two verticals and our two perspectives on that.
Moving back to the team side a little bit, I want to ask you two a little bit about have analytics affected how you scout, both scouting decisions, which players to scout, how you deploy scouts, and then also how have analytics affected scouting, and as these new data sources become more widely used and understood, how will they continue to affect the process of scouting?
I think absolutely they have. I mean, scouting and analytics go hand in hand. The two are both trying to get to the same answer, and they're both trying to evaluate a player and trying to figure out the how and why of a player and dig deeper on a player. And we've tried more and more this year to interact with our pro scouts and get them involved on the analytic front. We hired Zach a couple years ago to do draft analytics, and he was bringing them information on analytics for amateur prospects, and it would change some of what they had to go see. I mean, if there was a big disagreement, we'd encourage them, hey, go take another look and make sure that that you're right on this guy if there's a major disagreement between what the numbers are telling you and what your eyes are telling you. And I think the same thing happens on the pro side. I think if you're trying to make an evaluation picture of a player, you need all inputs into it, and I just think the two go hand in hand very well.
I would agree with what Josh said. I think for us, it's really important. We have obviously our in the field scouts. The analytics piece and the video piece is also really important as another check that we use and taking it further on the amateur side. If our scouts and our analytics are in line, that's great. It's where there's a difference where we have to go back and figure out why, and it might be as simple as a scout saying, well, John Doe can't skate. And that then factors into that, and on the pro side, it's used again in a similar way as a fact check, and then we've incorporated really backing it up with the video in our meetings and our conference calls and that sort of thing to find out exactly why we have a different view on different players.
Before I move back to some data questions, actually just Andrew, based on your experience on the team side, you have anything to add about sort of the notion about scouting and analytics either as separate things or combined?
I really want to make a Reese's "you got peanut butter in my chocolate" reference here, because they really do work better together. But I think here's the other thing about tracking data that's really going to open things up. It's going to make it easier to talk to scouts about what's happening with data, because you can connect the events much more directly and viscerally to what you're seeing in video action, because that time connection is going to be there almost automatically. So you can say, hey, this player is really good at zone entries. He's better than anyone else in the system, and that could mean nothing to the scout. well, it might mean something, but it'll mean less by you saying they're the best in the league. But if you then immediately can connect that data point back to a 10-video playlist, comparing them to someone else, then you start to get dialogue going between the other people who don't necessarily speak stats much better than you could have before.
So a little bit like the dashboard we saw earlier from using SportLogic passing data. Is that?
Yeah, I think when we look at scouting, we kind of forget that what you're really trying to do is use current or past information to predict the future. That's what you're trying to do. So why would you not have as much information as you possibly can, right? That's what predictions are, right? It's based on the amount of information you have. The more information you have, the better information you have, the more understanding that you have of that information, the better predictions you're going to be able to make for the future. That's what scouting is.
I'll just chime in on a little bit of a real life example for what they're mentioning is last year when we were talking about Andre Burakovsky, Arik and Dawson are two of our analytics guys. One of the, we're reading our scouting reports, we're going through the video. We obviously, we have dealing with a skilled player there, but one of the things that kept popping up, from Arik's, our analytics department was he is a really strong player in transition. And that, scouts, can use that term, this and that, but to paint it with actual data and then the video when Joe's watching the file and we're really reviewing it, and, because second round pick and third round pick was a significant acquisition cost. So for us, it was, that was one of the key metrics for how we want to play.
Getting back to kind of more of a data question again. Sort of a two-part question for both of you. What are the requirements that are needed from a technical side in terms of getting the data, whether it's going to be the tracking data, whether it's the and how portable is that to, obviously the NHL is resourced at a certain level. Junior hockey leagues, high school leagues, college leagues are at a different level, but is there a second best solution available in cases where that's not possible?
So from us, we have two solutions, right? We have a solution that's just based off broadcast cameras. So that's one solution, and that solution obviously is something we can do, and it's portable. There's no cameras involved. We have a second solution, which is a 6-camera setup that is a little bit more obviously involved and has to be moved around, a little bit more expensive to put in. The difference between the two really is a 6-camera setup gives you all the view of the entire ice, and obviously it's real time, and there's 3D body pose, including the stick. So that's the difference between that and our broadcast. So that's kind of where we are. So if we look at the 6-camera, obviously there is a lot in terms of setting it up, but if you're looking at the broadcast, the 6-camera, looking at the broadcast, obviously that's something we can do at any level, and that's why we're able to get the data right now for SHL, OHL, WHL, USHL, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, our system that we're putting in right now in every NHL building is definitely heavier, because not only do we have an optical solution, you don't have to worry about sticking stuff on people either. So we've got tags that we're being put on. The pucks are being custom made to interact with the system as well. It all has to be fairly well tuned to that. So it's tough in order to build the hardware. Was this a hardware or a software question that you wanted to ask? Because I can go to that too.
It's more of a hardware question.
Okay. So in order to get a system like that to work, you have to do a lot of tuning. You have to make sure that you're not missing blind spots on the ice. You have to get enough both theoretical coverage for how you think you're going to map everything out, and then a practical solution when that turns out to maybe not be as good as it was. So that's the process. That's why it's taking so long to get it all in across the league. It's a finely tuned process that has to be consistent across every building to get our thing to work. But once it does, you can just leave it in there forever and just start to apply the same sort of equipment after every game.
How much difference is there kind of between buildings in terms of how your setup is? Is it how much of a one-size-fits-all is it, or how much time does it take with each building to?
For us, the issue's more been who else is in that building, right? So if there's a basketball team in that building and we're setting up our cameras, it can get a little. And also when there's also like technical issues where people are unplugging things because they're trying to plug in something for another system. So that's kind of where it is. If we're in an arena or a marketplace where there isn't a basketball team, it seems to be a lot easier and cleaner for us, for sure.
Sorry.
I don't know if any of you have ever been up in a catwalk. I did my first catwalk back in September. I'm not ever going to do another one. But yeah, every building has a different ceiling setup, let alone whatever the other clients that are going to that. Like I think Madison Square Garden doesn't have a catwalk, so that has to be very custom deployed. Detroit's new building has its own bespoke system that apparently is different from every other one like that. But once you get past that organizational part of it, assuming you can stake out the places you need to put your equipment, it's a fairly standard setup with just a few little modifications based on point of view. Like I think jumbotrons can make a difference too, like how big and how low they can get. But otherwise, that's a second level adjustment. It's basically the same hardware. It's going to go in every place.
And last little point on this, is there, obviously that's a fairly involved process for getting this into the NHL. Do you foresee anytime soon there being a second best solution, whether it's Neil did tracking from video or something like that? How close do you think we are to anything like that being useful?
I don't know the answer because I'm not that familiar with that. I can just speak to where we're at, and we're at the point now where this is real time 3D body pose with stick. This is the kind of I think from my perspective, it's the holy grail of being able to do real time event data.
Yeah, I think like the previous iteration of this was a lot of human level collection as opposed to anything that's been completely automated. That still has a place in a lot of buildings or a lot of scenarios where you're not going to get a complete camera setup. You're going to have to work from a broadcast feed or something else that's set up like that. And I think if you have enough manpower, or whatever the gender neutral version of that is, personnel supply, you could do something with that that's going to get you 90% of the way there. Because we're still going to pick up a lot of details just from noting. If you had someone tracking every pass, you're going to get a lot of the way there. I just don't know what the actual functional difference is going to be between what we can do and what that setup will do.
Moving away from the technical side, more back to the team side, and this is for two next to me and Andrew, again, from your team experience. Do you know of any efforts that teams have made to sort of model the behavior, whether it's on-ice strategy or kind of personnel valuations of other teams? And is that something that you foresee increasing, or is that something you just don't want to talk about?
Can you be a little more specific about the kind of things that you would expect to see? Like, because everything you're trying to apply to one team with general data, you can apply to every other. So if you've got a system that's already giving you tracking data from every team, you're trying to compose the same pieces of information about players or systems or whatever you can universally.
I think one way to look at that question is we can take the data and we can look at things that are kind of outliers within it. There was one team Zach gets a lot of credit for this, but this summer found there was a team and it was a coach who switched teams to, and the pattern followed. In some of SportLogic's data there was certain data points that were off the charts that were following them. And then he kind of dug into it more, and we learned some things about some tendencies that they do. And we shared that with our coaching staff, and now our coaching staff knows that team does that and knows a new strategy. So, I mean, that's one way to look at that question, I guess.
And I guess the add-on to that would be if you know a team values certain traits in a player, then that would presume
For
assist you
trades
in...
and, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, teams are using the data for, if you're talking about pre-scouts and player evaluation of other players, teams are using the data to do that. Absolutely.
And Chris, you have, obviously it's slightly behind the curtain question, but just trying to get at not just what you think of a player, but what another team thinks about that same player to help in your kind of market valuation, I guess.
Well, it's hard to know exactly what every team, everybody wants to get the best possible player, right? And some teams might need a puck-moving defenseman, and you might have a surplus of that versus you need some size and strength or a skilled centerman. So I think that's pretty team-specific. I think one thing that we've utilized this year in adding a staff member to do more from the coaching analytics part of it, that's kind of been his focus, working with Arik and Dawson and looking at those nuances for each team and preparing our pregame stuff with using Chris Boucher, SportsLogic stuff and tailoring that as part of our coaching pregame planning.
So that's actually kind of a natural segue to another question is, how have analytics affected the evaluation of coaches, and how can and have coaches that have kind of good or bad buy-in affect kind of how you do your analysis and how much impact that can have on a team? It's a very broad question, but go whichever way you want with it.
So every time that I try to do any kind of a statistical analysis of a coach as part of a contribution to a shot system or something like that, I just quit, because coaches don't change teams very often. You don't have two coaches switching out, coaching the same team, so you're never going to get to see a direct difference there. But to Josh's point, when a coach changes teams, maybe you can notice something that transforms like that, and even that doesn't happen often enough mid-season to really give you a lot of information globally.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, I think a lot of people have tried coaching analytics kind of projects. I've seen articles written about it before. It's hard to do, but I mean, I think there's little pointers in there, like kind of what I was just talking about before, which is if you see some real outlier statistic, you might point it towards coaching, that maybe it's something that they've tried to do. Or if a team's, like kind of what you were just saying, if a team had a certain style, the personnel didn't change, the coach changes, and then all of a sudden there's a bunch of metrics that change, and maybe they become a very defensive team, and all of a sudden they're protecting the slot and not giving up any odd-man rushes. Like, maybe you can try and credit the coach with that. Maybe it's not the coach, but it could be.
To the same point, one of the things that I'm super excited about getting full track is that you're able to identify systemic pieces. Forechecks, neutral zone and offensive zone, different power play and penalty kill formations, things like that you can quantify that should be directly coach related. We can now do almost automatically through this kind of detection, because we can detect all the players at once.
That's maybe a little bit more, this is the style that I can't necessarily say how good or bad this coach is, but I know what he tries to do.
Right. And then at the same time, you can also figure out if you have comparable systems across different teams, that gives you a way in saying, well, is it working better with this team compared to other ones, knowing that you've got certain players that you can adjust for or figure out that they're playing a role there.
Yeah, and also these things take time to show up, right? It's a huge ocean liner that this coach is trying to turn in whichever direction he wants to. So if you think that 2 weeks after coaching change that the coach is going to have his system in place and they're going to be doing a specific thing where they're, let's say, I don't know, the forwards are flying the zone and they're off the glass each time, and that's what they're doing all the time. These things are going to take time to kind of show up in the data.
Well, the only thing I would say to, add on to that, when we hired Jared a few years ago, we had a really hard year, 48 points, and we played the exact same way the last few years as we were playing that year. So, minor tweaks maybe on the specialty team stuff, but the basis of our game did not change systemically.
So it's more about getting him better players.
That's a big piece.
Finishing up on that point, and this is maybe more for the guys at the end, but for everyone also. In terms of getting feedback on kind of the collection and definitions in the data, is that something you found that's helpful? Is that something that is part of your process, or is that something you wish you could do more of?
So I've been working with, I've been kind of the bridge between the people in the NHL who want to define events, because part of the condition is we're not just providing tracking data, we're providing a set of events that are going to be automated. And figuring out exactly how those should be tuned is a challenge. I think if Chris Baker wants to put up his hand, he can tell me whether or not I'm driving him nuts or not. All right. But I have to communicate between hockey-specific people who have to follow the rule book for a number of definitions on one side, and an engineering team that's very competent but doesn't have a lot of NHL experience. So in trying to figure out what that bridge has been between the two groups, I've had to try and translate what I think each side is trying to say to the other so that there is a legitimate dialogue there. So I enjoy parts of that in as much as it's easier if there's a rule book definition to follow that has to be enforced because it means Chris is always right, compared to if there's an engineering challenge with how something is estimated, which means I have to give Chris the bad news. But like, for example, the system's not going to be great at offside measurements because we can't measure skates. That's just the way it is. So if I'm trying to say back to each of these, to both of those groups, that this is something we want to look for, we have to make sure that we're aligned on all those different pieces. And I find that part satisfying enough because I like to bring harmony together. I like to make sure we're all aligned on those points. But I think also because the system that we're building at SMT is designed not just for hockey, but for other sports to follow, that language is going to be something that's consistent throughout the future. So making sure we've got a good program for that is useful.
From us, in terms of the event definitions, these event definitions for us go back 30 years. So these are not things that are changing, and it's really difficult. So that there's some pitfalls you can do if you start letting teams define these events, because Josh's definition is going to be different from Chris's definition, right? Of when you start getting into that granularity.
And you and I have had this discussion about a few different stats, and then, I mean, you guys are good enough to customize some of them to our definition, but taking it back to the coaches, it's another big problem is that, the coaches want things defined a certain way, and then and then they want it sortable, and it's hard. It's hard, the job you have to do to balance all that with all the teams. Yeah, for sure.
So let's say the quickest way to start an argument in a room full of hockey guys is to ask everybody to define scoring chances, right? Right away, it's going to happen. So if you're just having an argument over scoring chances, imagine when you're trying to define a puck battle. So that's why we try to make sure that these definitions are as binary and clear as possible. And then from those, as long as there's consistency with those definitions, the metrics that you're creating from that, then it's fine, right? Because everybody's kind of dealing with the same data, and you can create your own custom. So if you're focused on puck battles, let's say, right? For one team, it could be they could want to include a stick check. For another team, they don't want to include a stick check. Maybe they want to include puck protections, another team doesn't. So by making it as granular as possible, they can just pull the information they want out of it as they see fit.
How are we doing for time, Allison? Oh, wow. Okay. We've kind of flown through some stuff then. So that leads into talked a little bit about coaching and their receptiveness to this. How about the players? How much of this information do players take on? Is there a wide split in how much they use? Relatedly, does it matter if they do or don't?
I think you get the broad spectrum there. I think some players are inquisitive. Some players ask questions. Some players don't want to know. It's just you get the full array. I think it's up to the coaches to how they utilize the information in their meetings, or when they want to back up a certain point, they might utilize it. But in terms of players, at least for us, Josh, we get a full array of. Some are very inquisitive and want to know, and some have no desire to know specific stat-based analytics.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, as far as I know, there's some guys that are into it. There's some guys that are not. There's some guys that, like, especially when that whole summer of analytics started and everybody was talking about it, I got a lot of questions from players back then, and sometimes they're looking at it and I don't know. They don't say much, but then, this is an interesting story, is that a couple nights ago we had the Blue Jackets big charity event, and there was a former player who was there that night, and and Zach was there too, and I introduced him to him, and he's like, "Oh, the analytics guy. Analytics love me." And he started quoting his Corsi number and how his Wowie numbers. He was saying, "Everybody I played with, they were better with me than they were without them." I corrected him on a couple points, but the point is, he knew this stuff. He was thinking about it. He paid attention to it. But so I think some of them want to know, and some of them don't. And I don't know where the line is, because I think some of them keep it to themselves, or I don't hear about it, or whatever. But yeah, it's there in their minds for sure.
We're seeing it a little bit, but it's coming through skills coaches, from the players through the skill coaches up to us. So that's really the only kind of way we're seeing it from the players. The extent of what we provide for players is shifts. Pretty much they can view their own shifts, right? So there isn't really any analytics, and teams are not really anxious about showing players their numbers.
But you mentioned skills coaches. What kind of things are they looking at?
It's mostly about being able to pull video, right? So they want to look at, let's say they want to look at edge control coming off the half wall, whatever it might be. They'll be pulling those video clips and showing video clips and using that. That's really the extent of what the skills coaches are doing with it, with their players.
And I guess the second part of that question is, does it matter if players are? This is sort of a gotcha question that almost comes up sometimes, where and it's across sport. A player gets asked about a certain analytical point, and they give an answer like, "What is that? Get that out of my face!" And this is often taken as like the player being like backwards or something like that. And it's always struck me. And maybe baseball's a little different, but in most other sports, it's like things are happening too fast that if you're asking the player to think, you're asking too much during the game. And so that's my question is, does it matter if players are or are not interested in this directly?
I wouldn't want them to be. I would want them to focus on, like, if you have a stat that's actually connecting to a skill, like Chris was alluding to, like there's something about skating that a player can control that's very direct and that they can train for. If it's in the middle of the game, like I've seen enough, players should be watching the game more than they should be looking at a stat pad if that's in the middle of something. If they're trying to get numbers to improve a skill later, that's something that's a much different process that follows up with actual training with coaches and other people who are better at translating what the numbers mean to something the player can actually do. Every case that I've ever heard of where a player is obsessed with numbers, they're gaming those numbers. The player who will skate in, take a shot just to juice their Corsi, for example. I don't know how true that is in general, but it's definitely true anecdotally. Or if they think that they're going to get a better contract. I can give you very clear examples. Players never want to be on the ice at the end of a game on a 6-on-5 because a plus-minus goal will count against them if there's an empty net goal. That's a stat that you don't want to tell them. They will definitely try to control that piece of it because it's going to go into their contract. So you find a way to get a stat that will pay them more money, then they'll probably pay more attention more directly. And I think the easiest way to do that is to connect the micro stuff up to goals and team success.
Yeah, I don't think it should matter if they're interested or they aren't interested, but I also think I think of it as the shootout analogy, right? If we go back to the beginning of shootouts, the players that were doing those shootouts, they weren't creative, they weren't really interested in it, they were kind of, I'm not really good at this, I don't want to do this. Now you look at, as kids grew up doing shootouts, now there's a lot more creativity, they enjoy it, they're trying to do more things. I think that's what's going to happen with analytics, right? If these guys are growing up with it, the information is in front of them, as they get older, they're going to be more interested in it. Now they're not going to be interested because it wasn't there when you were growing up and becoming a hockey player.
So just to mirror off that point, 3-on-3 hockey was exactly the same way. Coaches who would think it's a crapshoot are not going to pay any attention to improving a system or spending time on that, just like they would with the shootout, until they realized or are convinced, hey, this stuff is going to matter in the long term, because there's only a finite amount of coaching time you have in a season, let alone in the off season. So that's going to demand, whatever you have available is going to demand time with whatever else you already had to deal with in the past.
That certainly seems to be the experience baseball has had, where now that sort of pitch FX and stuff like that has been around for a long time, now you have like high school pitchers when they get to college, hey, what's my spin rate? And if the college doesn't have it, they're like, well, I went the wrong place then because I don't have all my tools. So so you're saying that perhaps as it becomes more widely accepted, it's going to become more of the thought process of players coming up slowly but surely. Is that?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, if you ask, let's say, a baseball player that's my age about his launch angle, right? And then you ask a player, playing now, coming out of college, one guy's going to know what it is, one guy's going to be interested in it, the other guy's not going to care and not really have any interest in it.
I imagine that from your standpoint that there is a danger in kind of the gaming the stats issue Andrew was talking about, where if you want to be very careful about kind of whether you're benchmarking or goal setting or anything like that with a specific number, that you're doing something that is helpful for the team rather than can encourage selfish play? Or is that something that you just kind of avoid altogether?
I honestly haven't given it that much thought. I mean, if somebody is going to try and game microstats to the benefit of themselves to the detriment of the team, my guess is a coach would put a stop to that pretty quickly. I'm not really sure. I don't know. It can work both ways, I guess.
Yeah, I think the guys are still just talking about, when you hear them at the water cooler or in the locker room talking about around the league, they're still talking about, the goals and the things they see. They're not like, I got to improve my loose puck recovery rate.
I've never heard that.
They've never heard that. They don't talk like that. They don't think like that.
I guess a follow-up to that, though, is as some of those stats, like we can start to, track the puck battles and stuff like that. Is that going to be? Do you think that is going to be the kind of thing that players are going to start caring about? It's these seem like concepts that you know are important in the game of hockey. So now that you know they're important and there's a number on it, it's almost natural to where am I?
I'd guess maybe they would if they think it's if stuff like that's being tracked accurately, and they know that managers, coaches, media are all going to know that they're deficient in an area that they wouldn't have had proof they were deficient in before, then maybe they become concerned about it. But to me, that's kind of how that plays out.
So I remember about 5 years ago when Chris Tanev got his extension in Vancouver, the media reported it as being, it's the first Corsi contract, because it was like 4 years, 4.5, for a guy who had very strong back-end possession numbers. And he's a defenseman, so maybe the scoring isn't going to show up for him quite as well. And I remember there being talk afterwards about, well, are there going to be any more deals like this? And I don't remember as many that was obviously tied to that. But if you give a player incentive that they're going to get some number going, that it's going to make them millions of dollars, they're going to pay attention. I think it also depends on whether the people on the other side are going to pay as much attention to that, and whether the team's value is going to contribute directly back to that. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to have to become a stat that people start paying for. I mean, that's what's going to drive it, and there's not that many of those, to be honest with you.
Well, that's why I think that for defensemen in particular, that's where it's going to be the most interesting. Because a lot of offensive contributions from forwards, and even offensive from defensemen, are recognized. Valuing and putting a number on a defensive player's contribution off the puck is still very primitive, let alone hard. I think that's going to be my biggest question in the next 10 years is how can we better evaluate defensive play, and how much money is going to be tied into those contracts because of it. Just like has happened with baseball for exactly that same thing, because fielding has come along in the last 10 years with increased access to fielding data and runs prevented on defense, much more attributable to an individual player. They are getting paid for that. It'll happen here too.
That's kind of a perfect segue to kind of the question to wrap up is that's a very specific answer, but as broad as you want to be, kind of with the new understandings, whether it's from data that's existed that we understand more or new data coming online, how do you see it changing kind of both the on-ice version of the game and what I'll broadly call the business of the game, which is the team transactions, contracts, stuff like that. Kind of as generally or as specific as you want to get, what do you think is going to be the next 5-10 years?
I think any change is going to come slowly but surely. On the business side, like we were just talking about, like a new stat's going to come and it's going to start to be valued, and then it's going to start to impact how teams value it, and then it's going to start to impact how players are paid. But that stuff can take a long time. Like I said before, there's a lot of things that we learned once we started getting micro data from SportLogic that we didn't know before, and even that took a while to understand and to incorporate and to value, and so I don't know that even when this big influx comes of player and puck tracking data, that there's going to be massive immediate shift. I just think everything's going to happen pretty slowly.
Yeah, it's the defensive side of the game that's where the huge blind spot is, right? So, like Andrew mentioned, I think that's where we're going to get, but that's going to be slow in coming. There's teams who've had our data for years who still are trying to figure out the data. They're still trying to understand the data. So this isn't a thing that happens really quickly. It takes time for teams to first understand it, invest the time to understand it, then figure out how they're going to use it, and then implement that, and then get some kind of feedback from it. So it takes time.
If I'll editorialize just for a second here, and I think it's gonna take a long time, and then it's gonna happen right away. That's certainly that's been our experience is people took some time to learn stuff, and then they learned it, and then they all learned it at once, and all of a sudden some players are just not valuable anymore, and some players are extremely valuable who weren't before. So if it's anything like what sort of the experience of adding more data to basketball has done, I think that there's going to be a little of all of a sudden everyone's going to get it, and it's going to be you're going to look back and not recognize what existed 3 years ago.
But that's how research goes, right? That's how scientific research does. It takes forever, and all of a sudden, you have a huge jump, and that's what's going to happen. Absolutely.
So I have a slightly different take that I want to mention because it's very germane to the company. So SMT is primarily a broadcast company. Like a lot of the business that we do. So whenever anybody asks me, oh, where do you work? I say, well, it's SMT. It's like, who's SMT? And I say, have you ever watched a football game? You ever seen the yellow first down line? Well, that's us. And they all go, oh, okay. So a lot of the purpose of this product for the NHL is for broadcast. It's to enhance the broadcast experience in real time as immediately as possible. And the broadcasters are going to have to go through that exact same process in a slightly different way. So I don't know what the yellow first down line equivalent is in hockey. I know it's not the glowing puck because we tried it and it didn't work. A subtler version of that is applicable. There are at least a few cases where you would like to be able to see a little bit of a hint of where the puck was because the puck is small and fast and tough to see. I don't know exactly what the next discovery process is going to be, but broadcasters will be at least a little more open about trying to explore what that data does because there's a direct translation between whatever you put on the screen and advertising revenue because more people are watching. So I think you're probably going to see some things evolve that might not be useful to hockey teams, but are going to be useful to networks because it'll slightly change the way the game is watched in an effort to bring in more fans who weren't doing it before. And that's the thing that I'm really looking forward to on the public side of things because I can talk about it a lot more because eyeballs are good and team secrecy stuff is less good if I'm not working for a team.
I think we're about out of time, so thanks to the panelists for an enjoyable discussion.
Thank you.